In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the newly released Radeon RX 7600. So this is the ASRock Phantom Gaming Edition. I have done a review on this, comparing it with much older graphics cards, an RX 480, GTX 970. It's basically things around like a GTX 1060, 1650, those sort of 1660, those cards. But now we're going to be taking a look at how it compares with Intel's ARC graphics card, because this one has been getting some price cuts recently. So this one is the ARC A770 limited edition. You can get the exact same Phantom Gaming cooler for the Intel ARC A750 and A770. So I have the A770, so I went ahead and compared these two cards, and we'll go over the results in a little bit. But I was thinking that the A750 might be a more price equivalent competitor to the RX 7600, but as these results will show, Intel still has a long way to go in order to catch up to AMD and Nvidia. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, here we are, showdown time. RX 7600 versus Intel A770. First things first, all tests done, we're using resizable VAR, because if you have it, you basically turn it on and forget about it, because it helps the Intel card by a whopping 40%. We're talking 40% improvement for the Intel card. For the AMD card, it also benefits from it, so there's no reason to keep this feature disabled, provided you have a motherboard that supports it. For the test system, I'm using the same system that I used for the review of the 7600. So we're using Windows 10 because that's what I use. The Ryzen 9 7950X3D because it's the fastest gaming CPU, and it eliminates any kind of CPU bottleneck that we could run into for the games that were tested. We're using a Gigabyte X670 Aorus Elite AX motherboard because it's fairly affordable and it's still giving you the most PCIe lanes for that chipset. 64 gigabytes of G.Skill Flare X, so we don't run into any system memory limitations. And then I am using a 1250 watt. But the main thing that's important here is that we are testing with 1080p resolution, so no 1440p, only 1080p, because if you're spending around $300 or less, you're most likely going to be gaming at 1080p. Intel ARC driver is the latest one at time of filming, and the Radeon driver is also the launch driver for the RX 7600, so 23.5.1. First game tested, Borderlands 3. Now, with Intel, I ran into a problem. Every time I tried to start this game up with the Intel graphics card, it would try to run the game off of the integrated graphics on the Ryzen CPU. I went into Windows graphics settings, I tried to force performance mode, force the game to run on the A770, and it still wouldn't do it. The only way I was able to benchmark this game properly was to go into the BIOS and disable the integrated graphics so that I could force the game to run on the discrete GPU, because I took away the integrated GPU. With that being said, at Ultra Preset, the 7600 did end up winning by quite a bit, 140 FPS average versus 98 on the A770. For those of you that were expecting some kind of magical graphics update to improve performance, at least in this game, I'm not really seeing it, but you know, it's still early days here in this roundup. So next up, I tested Godfall because it's a very easy game to just run off of Epic Games. It's a UE4 title, and I can just max it out. Epic preset, these are the results. 130 FPS average for the 7600 versus 124 for the A770. So in this game, both GPUs were much closer together at 1080p, and it was almost neck and neck, but the win still went to the 7600. Next, I tested the Decima engine. So this is featured in Horizon Zero Dawn. This game is unique because it's not a UE4 game. It is a console port from the PlayStation 4 originally. So we tested it at the ultimate preset. So this is the maxed out graphics settings, everything maxed out. The RX 7600 averaged 126 FPS versus 101 FPS on the A770. So pretty good showing so far for AMD's new little entry card that's sub $300. Next, I tested the Foundation engine. So this is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. For some reason, a lot of people think this game runs on UE4. It does not use UE4. This is Foundation Engine. It is a proprietary engine. So, Shadow of the Tomb Raider at ultra settings, 142 FPS on ultra settings for the RX 7600 versus 115 FPS for the ARC A770. Not exactly close to each other. In fact, the minimum FPS at 108 on the 7600 is actually closer to the average on the Intel GPU than the actual averages. Next, I tested a very popular MMO because I think this represents more of a real-world scenario because a lot of people play Final Fantasy XIV, so I decided to include it. I myself used to play it a ton. It represents the Crystal Tools engine, so another different game engine. I like to feature different game engines in a lot of benchmarks because I think it shows you how well-rounded a particular graphics card can be. So in this case, with Crystal Tools engine on max settings, remember this is DX11 only. This game does not have a DX12 client. So DX11, 163 FPS average for the 7600 versus 153. So only a 10 FPS difference between the two of them. So on paper they look pretty close. However, the minimum FPS is where the AMD card really shines at 81 FPS as the minimum versus 42 on the Intel GPU. I did 3 different runs and it averaged the minimum across 3 runs, and it still only averaged 42 FPS. So there's something going on with the drivers and DX11 because this is a DX11 game. You can clearly see the AMD card silky smooth in the Limsa Lomenzas and all that kind of stuff because you're going to be above 60 all the time in this title with the 7600. Next, I tested Far Cry 6 because it's a different engine. So this is the Dunia engine. The Dunia engine is unique in that it's relatively new. Far Cry 6 is a couple of years old now, but it's still a modern game by today's standards. I was able to test it on the Ultra preset. So we averaged with the 7600, 132 FPS versus 96 FPS on the A770. Next, I tested a very popular game to release earlier this year, back in February, Hogwarts Legacy. This is a game that has gotten a lot of hype prior to launch. Even after launch, it's still been talked about time and time again. In fact, it's probably going to be a contender for Game of the Year because it is actually a pretty novel game, probably the best Harry Potter-based game that we've gotten in a long time. So I tested this one on high because it does use a lot of VRAM. But even if you increase it to Ultra, what ends up happening is you get weird like texture pop-in on the RX 7600, but the FPS stays relatively well above 60. But because of the way they've patched this game since the launch, if you have a GPU that runs out of VRAM, what ends up happening is your textures like load and then unload and load and unload depending on where your camera is looking. So it ends up being a very inconsistent experience in terms of the immersion. So for that, we tested it on high, and despite Intel having 16 gigabytes of VRAM, it didn't really help with the averages here. So we're seeing 97 on the 7600 versus 74 on the A770. Next up, I tested The Last of Us Part 1, probably the most infamous game to release this year. This game came out a couple of months ago, I think back in March, if I'm not mistaken. So this one averaged 75 FPS on the 7600 versus 49 on the A770. For some reason, no matter what I did, in all cases testing at 1080p, not once did this game ever max out the VRAM on the Intel GPU because it has 16 gigabytes. However, for whatever reason, this game hates the Intel GPU, and I could never really get it to go above 60 unless I dropped it down to like low. It just really didn't run. You bump it up to Ultra, you basically drop the FPS average to like 42. But the AMD card, you bring it up to Ultra, it runs out of VRAM, and then it drops to like 60. So, and it's kind of inconsistent with the frame rate, so, or the frame consistency. So both of them kind of fail on this game, although if you drop it to high, the AMD card can pass, and it is playable at 75 average, and the minimum is at 56. So yeah, the minimum does dip below 60, but this is the most playable experience at native resolution. Now, if you turn on FSR or XESS, then you can get much better frame times, But that's not what we're really testing here. We're testing the overall throughput and rasterization. And this is the Naughty Dog engine, so again, it's another unique engine that's not your typical Unreal. Speaking of Unreal, the last game that I tested was probably the latest UE4 game that came out. So this is Star Wars Jedi Survivor. A game that was also kind of riddled with controversy when it launched because it was very CPU bound, and then they kind of fixed it, but then it's still very CPU heavy. But in any case, at Ultra Preset, the 7600 managed to average 99 FPS, the Intel GPU 76 FPS. If we average all of the games that were tested, we come out to 123. So it's very easy to remember. So 1, 2, 3. So 123 FPS for the 7600, 98 FPS for the Intel GPU. If we convert this into percentages, so for the games that I tested, that ends up being 25% faster on the 7600. So the 7600, sub $300 versus the Intel GPU, which is typically around $330 for the A770. The 16 gigabyte reference card is getting harder to find. So it's starting to become like a collector's item at this point. But the AMD GPU, cheaper, less VRAM, but it ended up being 25% faster. Power consumption while gaming, 168 average while gaming for the 7600 versus 233 for the Intel GPU. So it's faster and it uses less energy. So it's looking pretty good if you're gaming at 1080p at this point. Temperatures. This is going to come down to how good the cooler is. Now, I know with the Intel card, I tested with the reference card because that is what I have, because it's kind of a collector's item, so I'm only going to really use that one. And then for the AMD card, I do have the ASRock Phantom Gaming, which is a really nice cooler. It's probably one of the best coolers that you can get for a entry-level mid-range GPU like the 7600. It goes to show 61 Celsius under load versus 72 on the Intel GPU. And that's because the AMD card uses a lot less energy. So it's going to run cooler, so it's not going to be that hot. How that translates into fan noise? Well, it ends up being quieter as well. So 26 dBA versus 35 dBA while gaming on both GPUs. So 7600 is looking pretty good. Fan speed. I like this metric because this is how I can actually gauge if a card is loud or not. So just to give people an idea, above 1600 RPM, you can start hearing the GPU if it's on the floor and you're sitting at your desk. Thing above 1600 is where you start hearing the fans above your case fans. So you can see here, the 7600, 1147 was the average in terms of the fan speed. That's very quiet. You can't really hear that over your case fans. A770, 1784, so not intrusively loud by any means. You will hear it while you're gaming the Intel card, but it's not like it's annoyingly loud or anything. So it's a decent trade-off. So conclusion time. What are my final thoughts? So the ARC A770 has improved via driver updates over the last 6 months. However, as you guys can see, now that AMD are releasing their newer generation cards throughout this year, starting with these more mid-range options like the 7600, what's ended up happening is the driver updates on the Intel card are just not enough to close the gap. Actually, the competition for the Intel card is the RX 6700 or maybe even the 6700 XT, especially since those cards are discounted now and they offer better performance than not only the Intel GPU, but they also offer a little bit better performance than the 7600. The fact that the 7600 basically beat the Intel card in all the games that we tested here doesn't really look good in terms of where Intel is at right now. So the A770 is stuck competing with the new 7600, but it's also stuck competing with these older discounted RDNA 2 GPUs, which actually offer pretty good value. For those that don't pay more than $300 for a new GPU, the 7600 is looking pretty impressive. However, you can find 6700, 6700 XT, and even the 6750 XT for just a little bit more than this card, and they offered better performance, and they have more VRAM. So the AMD cards right now are offering the best value objectively speaking. So anyone still using a GTX 1060, 1050 Ti, the older AMD RX 580, 570, 480, 470, etc., all those older cards, even something like an RTX 2060, 2060 Super, any of these GPUs that have less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM will benefit from upgrading to an RX 7600 or something similar. What are these GPUs good for? You know, a lot of people like to bash the mid-range, but the reality is the mid-range is the volume moneymaker for these GPU manufacturers. So these GPUs specifically are great for esports titles. They don't use a lot of electricity. They're not going to heat up your room if you're gaming, playing League of Legends all day, or if you're raiding in endgame dungeons in Endwalker for a couple of hours, or you're playing WoW or something like that, or MOBAs or PUBG or RTS games like Age of Empires 4 or StarCraft 2, etc. These GPUs like the 7600 actually are pretty good value at the end of the day for these type of games, and these are the type of games that most people play. Not these games like Cyberpunk and, you know, Witcher 3, which is pretty old game at this point, but you know, this is the reality of the gaming market. So other considerations: used market, used GPUs, like used 2080s. I will say that the 7600 is as fast as an RTX 2080 Super, just to put things into perspective for those that are thinking that, oh, you can get a better GPU from the used market. Well, not really, considering the 7600 is as fast as a 2080 Super, and you don't get any warranty or anything like that. So 7600 is still offering pretty good value at this point. But last gen clearance like 6700, 6750 XT, etc., those are probably the only ones that are really worth considering if you're gaming at 1080p high refresh. But other than that, those are my thoughts on the 7600 and how it compares with Intel's best GPU today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you guys have a question, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, please leave a like. It does help me out. It does motivate me to keep making tech-related content like this. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.